Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Sarah Streicher's TV series, The Wilds. Now, I've seen the first 2 seasons of this. I think so far there are only 2. There might be more. Definitely the end of season 2 set up for a 3rd season. But I think the second season was released in 2022, and it's now 2024, so that may not be happening. But I don't know. So, this is an interesting show. It's a show of 2 parts. And I say that not along a season break, but along a sort of thematic break. So, on the one hand, you have a group of young women in the first season, and in the second season, a group of young women and a group of young men who are in a survival situation on a tropical island after their planes crash while they are going to a weekend retreat. So you have Fatin Jadmani, Dorothy Dot Campbell, Martha Blackburn, Rachel Reed, Shelby Goodkind, Nora Reed, Tony Shalifo, and Leah Rilke, who are the women on the island, the girls on the one island. They are very different in temperament, in worldview, in ideology, etc., and in psychological stability. And the first season largely follows their struggles to survive on this island, and a few of them don't survive, or don't seem to survive. So we've got those things going on. In the second season, we have a group of boys who are their sort of counterparts, same number, and they're on a comparable island, etc., etc. So that's one part. And actually, that, I think, is really, really fascinating. I think it's really well written. I think the conflicts are interesting. Some of the conflicts, especially later in the second season, do feel slightly forced, slightly like they're moving toward that sort of, this is high school drama and like high school TV drama, and we have conflict for the sake of conflict because we need to pan the episode out to 45 minutes or whatever it is. But you do genuinely have complex, interesting characters who are put in this very challenging situation, and they need to figure out not only how to live, but how to live with one another. And it's actually really, really good. That element of it is really strong. The relationships between the characters develop in interesting and surprising ways. Characters who at first seemed relatively one-dimensional almost. And I would say Martha Blackburn is really a good example of this. Martha initially seems like quite a one-dimensional character. She's just sort of super optimistic, but as the series goes on, she becomes much more complicated. We find out that she has a dark past. We find out that she actually becomes sort of the hunter of the group, despite being a lover of animals and being really, really uncomfortable with hurting animals. But then she develops psychological issues because at one point she sort of realizes how much damage she's doing to the creatures that she's catching so that they can eat and stay alive. And so I think this is a really, really good example of a great character arc, a character who starts out fairly simple with not many layers and gets more and more layers as it goes on. So I think that's really good. And the show does this consistently, right? Like pretty much all of the characters because you have a fairly limited main core cast in the first season, just the 8 girls on the island, you get to develop them extensively. The boys are a little bit less developed because they are depicted only in season 2 alongside ongoing developments with the girls and alongside the third facet of the show, which I haven't talked about yet, but I'm going to. Trust me, because boy, do I have stuff to say about it. But across the board, with all of these characters, they actually get developed in interesting and complex ways. Everybody gets their own conflict. Everybody gets at least a certain degree of backstory developed for them. And so I think it does a really, really good job. Now, the other element of this, the thing that I actually don't like at all about the show, is that this is all an experiment. The planes did not actually crash. The people on the planes were drugged. The planes were landed. They were unloaded and basically sort of set adrift in the ocean off the coast of these islands. This is an experiment being conducted by a woman named Gretchen Klein. She had some kind of university background in psychology, it seems. She is no longer, apparently, working for the university, with good reason. She is now head of these foundations, the Dawn of Eve and Twilight of Adam. Ostensibly, and I say ostensibly for good reason, and I'll get to why in just a little bit. Ostensibly, this is an experiment meant to prove that women would create a more stable, equitable, supporting, loving society than men do. And so she uses the boys on their island as a control group, and she uses the women as an experimental group, theoretically. The problem is, okay, so if you know nothing about psychology, nothing about the social sciences, and how to actually run an experiment properly, sure, you might enjoy this angle. If you know anything about the social sciences, about psychology, about the ethics of human experimentation, and about how these kinds of disciplines actually function, there's so many problems with this. First off, it's crimes. You cannot act. She effectively kidnaps these people. She has in each group confederates, people who are in on the experiment. And that's fine. That's a normal element of psychological experimentation. But nobody else in this group has agreed to go along with this. Right? So none of these people or their parents, because these are minors, it is important to remember that. Dot turns 18 while they're on the island, but when she gets there, she's underage. So nobody in this group or their parents / legal guardians have agreed for them to participate in this experiment, which means that this is kidnapping. So legally, that's a problem. There are actual substantial long-term damage done to them. Rachel, for instance, loses her hand. Yeah. So those elements, there are legal problems here. There are also ethical problems from a purely scientific perspective. This experiment would never, ever, 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 ever get IRB approval. For those of you who don't know, the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. These are boards that are set up basically to make sure that human trials will not in any way endanger the human subjects more than is absolutely necessary for the experimental design. And if you came to an institutional review board and said, I want to put a bunch of teenagers on an island by themselves and hope that they survive and form a society, no. Because that stands an incredibly good chance of actually leading to the deaths of your subjects, which means that would never, ever, ever get permission. And so, this is one of the weird things about the whole setup. Gretchen's idea is that this experiment, to try and prove that the girls would produce a better society on the island than the boys would. There's nothing you can do with it. She envisions this as sort of being this vanguard of a matriarchal revolution in which people would see, actually, male-run societies are terrible. We should let women run things. I don't hate that conclusion necessarily. I think there is some substance to that idea, but there's nothing you can do with this, right? You can never, ever publish any results of this because you've been doing crimes and because it's unethical. No publisher would publish this, and if you did publish this, it would be tantamount to a confession to the crimes that you've been committing. So there's all of that. The other big problem with the experimental design here is that it is in Gretchen's choice of Confederates, right? So everybody who's on both of these islands is troubled in some way, some more severely than others. But on the boys' island, Gretchen's main Confederate is a guy named Seth Novak. Sorry. On the girls' island, it's a girl named Nora Reed. Nora is very quiet. She's very smart. She sort of keeps to herself. She's awkward, but harmless in every way. Seth Novak, by contrast, has a violent history, which Gretchen knows when she recruits him to be her Confederate for this experiment. He has separation issues because he was abandoned by his mother. And when his girlfriend broke up with him, he stole her cat and possibly physically injured her or even killed her. We don't know for sure. But the idea behind Gretchen's experiment is basically that all things being equal, women will produce a better society than men. If you actually wanted to design an experiment to test that, and you are willing to ignore all of the other ethical issues associated with kidnapping people and putting them on an island against their will and without their parents' consent, as soon as you put someone in that experiment as your Confederate that you know to have a history of violence, you have invalidated the study. Especially because Seth is, in fact, the source of the primary conflicts between the boys on their island. Seth sexually assaults another kid on the island, and that becomes the thing that drives a wedge between the group. They were, in fact, getting along better than the girls had been prior to Seth doing what he did. So the fact that he has been put there by Gretchen means that she has in fact contaminated the experiment. Which is another reason it would never ever get published, and another reason why no serious psychologist or sociologist would ever take this as a trustworthy experiment. Now, all of that gets fucking negated at the end of season 2, because alongside the stuff that's occurring on the island, we're getting through sort of flashbacks through the narratives told by the girls in the first season and the girls and boys in the second season. They are being interviewed by these people, Daniel Faber, a psychologist or a sociologist or a psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever it is, Dean Young, who is supposed to be some sort of official agent or whatever, and Gretchen herself. While all of that is going on, Leah Rilke, who's really sort of the protagonist, I would say, to the extent that there is a main character, she is trying to figure out a way of escaping and basically beating this system, which she seems to do with the help of Dean Young. But at the moment where the girls and boys have sort of joined forces, they've all been freed from their isolation rooms where they've been held, and they are sort of making their way through this facility. It turns out that Gretchen had planned for this, or this was an eventuality that she had planned for, not that she intended it to happen necessarily, but she has taken all the records, all of the information, and basically they are now sort of trapped in this facility or on the roof of this facility in, I think it's Peru. And as Gretchen and Daniel and a couple of other people are on this private jet, basically leaving, they start talking about how phase 3 of the experiment has begun. Now, I'm not an insane psychologist with no ethics or sense of experimental design, so maybe this has just gone over my head, but if your objective had been to prove that girls would produce a better society than boys on an island, A, you haven't achieved that. B, there's no phase 3 of that experiment where leaving them in an isolation facility in Peru is going to give you any more useful data. So they kind of undercut everything that the series had been supposed to be about. But it does seem like phase 3 is what season 3 is supposed to be about. Again, I don't see anywhere it can go that's going to make any sense. This it honestly kind of feels like a show where it was picked up and they never really expected to go to a season 2, so they had to invent something for a season 2. Then they never expected it to go to a season 3, so they had to invent something for a season 3. And we'll see whether they do. Again, the second season of this came out in 2022, 2 years ago. I don't know whether a third season is on the horizon. I can try and look this up really quickly on Wikipedia, but yeah, I mean, I think it's... For anybody who knows anything about psychology, sociology, experimental design, etc., it's an incredibly problematic element to this series.